Squadron leader James "Ginger" Hartwell pressed his left hand against the gaping hole in his Spitfire's fuselage as the North Sea wind screamed through the cockpit at 12,000 feet above the Dutch coast. The date was September 23, 1943, and every gauge on his instrument panel told the same story. His aircraft was dying, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature climbing, the Merlin engine coughing like a tubercular old man. Through his cracked canopy, he could see the contrails of Hauptmann Klaus Brenner's Messerschmitt formation circling above him like vultures, their radios crackling with laughter in heavily accented English. "Ach, the Tommy limps home to his mother," came Brenner's voice over the emergency frequency. "Perhaps we should put the wounded bird out of its misery, ja?" Meet. But Hartwell wasn't limping home. Against every regulation in the Royal Air Force manual, against the direct orders crackling through his headset from Group Control, and against 23 years of carefully cultivated common sense, he was turning his crippled fighter toward the most heavily defended German airfield in occupied Holland. His left hand found the toggle switch he had jury-rigged beneath his seat 3 weeks earlier during a sleepless night in the maintenance hangar. A switch that connected to 40 pounds of improvised explosive charges he had personally wired throughout his aircraft's wing roots and fuselage. Historical records indicate that no one in the 611th Squadron knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the mathematics of aerial warfare and transform a routine escort mission into the most devastating single aircraft attack in Royal Air Force history. James Hartwell had grown up in the shadow of the Yorkshire Dales, where his father worked the same limestone quarry that had claimed his grandfather's lungs and his great-grandfather's life. The Hartwell family had been blasting stone from those hills since 1872, and young James was expected to follow tradition until the morning of his 16th birthday, when he watched a Royal Flying Corps Avro trainer circle the valley like a mechanical bird of prey. The pilot, a veteran of the Western Front named Captain Morrison, had made an emergency landing in Thompson's pasture, and James had sprinted 3 miles across the moors to help push the aircraft clear of the stone walls. Morrison, impressed by the boy's knowledge of mechanical systems and his fearless approach to the still-spinning propeller, had spent 2 hours explaining the mysteries of flight controls and engine management. "You've got the touch, lad," Morrison had said, wiping grease from his hands with James's shirt. "The machine talks to you. I can see it in your eyes." That conversation planted a seed that would grow through 5 years of saving every penny from his quarry wages, 5 years of studying aeronautical texts borrowed from the Bradford Public Library, and 5 years of dreaming about clouds and altitude instead of limestone dust and black lung. When Britain declared war on Germany in September of 1939, James Hartwell was among the first men to queue outside the Royal Air Force Recruitment Office in Leeds, and his aptitude scores placed him directly into advanced pilot training. From a historical perspective, those instincts Morrison had recognized would soon be all that stood between 47 Allied bombers and complete annihilation over the industrial heart of the Third Reich. His training at RAF Cranwell had been brutal and swift, compressed from the peacetime standard of 2 years into 8 months of dawn-to-dusk flying, gunnery practice, and formation discipline. Hartwell distinguished himself not through natural flying ability, which was merely average, but through an almost supernatural understanding of aircraft systems and an uncanny talent for improvisation under pressure. When Flight Lieutenant Davies's Supermarine Spitfire suffered complete hydraulic failure during a training exercise over the Wash, it was Hartwell who had talked him through a manual gear extension using a combination of gravity, centrifugal force, and a carefully timed inverted roll that no instructor had ever taught. When the station's only working radio beacon failed during a night navigation exercise in heavy weather, Hartwell had jury-rigged a direction finder using his aircraft's landing light and the reflection pattern off the River Thames, guiding 7 other pilots safely home through conditions that should have claimed at least 3 aircraft. His instructors noted in their reports that Pilot Officer Hartwell possessed an intuitive grasp of emergency procedures that borders on the uncanny and a dangerous tendency toward unauthorized innovation that requires close supervision. But they also noted that other pilots had begun to request Hartwell as their wingman, and that survival rates in exercises where he participated had improved by 37%. By the spring of 1942, when he was posted to the 611th Squadron at RAF Biggin Hill, James Hartwell had earned a reputation as the pilot you wanted beside you when everything went wrong. This historical analysis shows that his gift for turning disaster into opportunity would soon be tested in ways that would challenge every principle of military discipline and personal survival. The strategic situation in September of 1943 had reached a critical juncture that would determine whether the Allied bombing campaign against German industrial targets could continue or would collapse under the weight of unsustainable losses. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing using formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses, believing that their heavy defensive armament and tight formation flying could penetrate German airspace without escort fighters. The mathematics of this strategy had proven catastrophically wrong. In the previous month alone, Allied bomber losses over occupied Europe had reached 28% per mission, a rate that would eliminate entire bomber groups within 4 months of sustained operations. German fighter tactics had evolved from individual combat to coordinated group attacks that could overwhelm even the most disciplined bomber formations, and Luftwaffe commanders had concentrated their most experienced pilots into specialist interceptor units based at heavily fortified airfields throughout Holland, Belgium, and northern France. The mission planned for September 23, 1943, represented a desperate attempt to break this cycle of attrition through a deep penetration raid against the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Marienburg, defended by what intelligence estimated to be over 200 German fighters operating from 6 major airfields within a 100-mile radius. The Royal Air Force had committed every available long-range fighter to escort duty, including the newly modified Spitfire Mark IX variants that could barely reach the target area with enough fuel remaining for 10 minutes of combat. Wing Commander Peterson had been brutally honest during the pre-mission briefing that morning. "Gentlemen," he had said, pointing to the red line drawn across the map of occupied Europe, "we are asking you to fly farther than your aircraft were designed to go, fight longer than your fuel supplies should allow, and return home across 400 miles of hostile territory. The mathematics are not in our favor." But the mathematics of warfare were about to be recalculated by one pilot's willingness to transform his fighter aircraft into something the designers had never intended and the enemy had never encountered. The formation of 47 B-17 Flying Fortresses had crossed the Dutch coast at 26,000 feet, their silver wings catching the morning sunlight like a vast flock of mechanical eagles. Squadron leader Hartwell flew with the close escort, his Spitfire Mark IX, holding position 300 feet above and to the starboard of the leading bomber group. The flight had been routine until they reached the initial point 20 miles short of the target, where German radar had vectored the first wave of interceptors into attack position. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner led the elite second group of Jagdgeschwader 26, flying the newest Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft equipped with 420mm cannons and armor plating that could withstand anything but direct hits from heavy machine gun fire. Brenner himself had claimed 63 Allied aircraft shot down, including 11 four-engine bombers, and his reputation among German pilots rivaled that of the legendary Adolf Galland. His tactical approach combined mathematical precision with psychological warfare, using radio intercepts to taunt Allied pilots in perfect English, while coordinating attacks that exploited every weakness in American bomber formations. On this particular morning, Brenner had positioned his 24 fighters in a climbing spiral that would bring them down through the escort screen in a high-speed slashing attack designed to scatter the Spitfires and leave the bombers vulnerable to follow-up waves. But mathematical precision had not accounted for Squadron Leader Hartwell's modifications to his aircraft, modifications that violated every safety regulation in the Royal Air Force technical orders and transformed his fighter into something between an interceptor and a guided munition. As the German formation rolled into their attack dive, Hartwell made a decision that would either save the bomber stream or eliminate everything he had worked to protect. He pushed his throttle past the red line, rolled inverted, and dove directly into the center of Brenner's formation while activating a system that no German pilot had ever encountered and no Allied commander had ever authorized. 3 weeks earlier, during a sleepless night in the maintenance hangar at RAF Biggin Hill, Squadron Leader Hartwell had been studying after-action reports from recent bomber escort missions when he noticed a disturbing pattern in the mathematics of aerial combat. German fighters consistently achieved their highest success rates during the initial attack phase, when they could choose the time, angle, and altitude of engagement against Allied formations that were locked into defensive patterns by their need to protect the bombers. Once the German attack developed, individual Allied fighters found themselves fighting defensive engagements where their superior maneuverability was negated by the enemy's ability to dictate the terms of combat. Hartwell had calculated that a single Allied fighter, properly positioned and equipped, could disrupt the coordination of an entire German formation if it could present a threat that forced enemy pilots to abandon their planned attack pattern. The solution he developed violated every principle of fighter tactics taught at RAF Cranwell, but it was grounded in mathematical logic that he had verified through careful study of combat film and loss statistics. Working alone in the hangar during off-duty hours, Hartwell had removed the armor plating from behind his pilot's seat and replaced it with 40 pounds of plastic explosive connected to a deadman switch wired to his left hand. The charges were positioned to neutralize his aircraft's wing structure and engine mount in a controlled explosion that would create a debris field approximately 200 feet in diameter, but only if he manually activated the system while pointing directly at an enemy formation. From a tactical perspective, the psychological effect of watching an Allied fighter deliberately sacrifice itself in front of their formation would, he calculated, cause German pilots to break off their attack approach and scatter to avoid the expanding debris cloud. This would give the remaining Spitfire escorts time to engage individual German fighters on more equal terms, while protecting the bomber formation from coordinated attack. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, the engineering officer, had discovered Hartwell's modifications during a routine inspection, but had agreed to keep the information classified after reviewing Hartwell's mathematical analysis and combat projections. "It's either brilliant or completely insane, James," Morrison had said while examining the wiring harness, "but the numbers don't lie. If you can get one German formation to break off their attack run, you might save 20 or 30 bombers." Neither man had discussed the obvious fact that Squadron Leader Hartwell would not survive to see whether his theory worked in practice. The first indication that something was wrong came at 0937 hours when German ground control began vectoring additional fighter groups toward the bomber stream from bases as far away as Denmark and northern Germany. Squadron Leader Hartwell monitored the radio traffic through his German-language headset, a modification he had made to his communications equipment that allowed him to eavesdrop on Luftwaffe tactical frequencies. What he heard sent a chill through his chest that had nothing to do with the -40-degree temperature at altitude. All groups," came the voice of the German ground controller. "Priority target inbound. Estimate 100 heavy bombers with reduced escort. Repeat, reduced escort. All available aircraft are directed to intercept." The intelligence briefing that morning had assured the aircrew that German fighter strength in the target area was limited to approximately 60 aircraft, but the radio traffic suggested that the Luftwaffe was committing everything available to intercept this particular mission. Hartwell quickly calculated that his formation of 24 Spitfires would soon face odds of nearly 6-1 against pilots who knew the local terrain and could operate close to their own bases. The bomber formation, flying straight and level to maintain accuracy for the bomb run, would be helpless against coordinated attacks from multiple directions. But as Hauptmann Brenner's formation rolled into their initial attack position, Squadron Leader Hartwell realized that the conventional tactical response of climbing to meet the threat would play directly into German hands by allowing follow-up groups to attack the bombers from different angles, while the escorts were engaged at high altitude. His hand moved instinctively to the toggle switch beneath his seat, and for the first time since installing the explosive charges, he considered the possibility that his theoretical calculations were about to become tragically practical. Historical records show that the mathematics of survival had shifted, and only the mathematics of sacrifice offered any hope for the men flying formation around him. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner had planned his attack with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most successful fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. His 24 Focke-Wulf fighters would dive through the Spitfire escort in a high-speed slashing attack, with each German pilot assigned specific sectors of responsibility to prevent the British fighters from coordinating their defense. The bomber formation, locked into their bomb run approach, would be unable to take evasive action for at least 6 minutes, giving Brenner's pilots multiple opportunities to make firing passes from angles that maximized their firepower advantage while minimizing exposure to return fire. Intelligence reports had indicated that the Spitfire Mark IX aircraft had limited fuel reserves at this distance from their home bases, forcing them to conserve ammunition and avoid extended combat that would prevent their return to England. Brenner had briefed his pilots to expect aggressive but brief resistance from the escort fighters, followed by a fighting withdrawal that would leave the bombers vulnerable to successive waves of German interceptors already climbing to attack altitude from airfields throughout the region. At 0942 hours, as his formation rolled inverted to begin their attack dive, Brenner spotted the lead Spitfire climbing to meet his threat, and smiled with professional satisfaction. The British pilot was reacting exactly as German tactical doctrine predicted, climbing into a head-on engagement that would allow Brenner's superior firepower and armor protection to neutralize the threat quickly and efficiently. But as the range closed to 800 meters, Brenner realized that something was fundamentally wrong with the tactical picture developing in front of him. The Spitfire was not following standard Royal Air Force intercept procedures. Instead of climbing to gain altitude advantage, the British aircraft was diving directly into the center of his formation, while accelerating past any reasonable tactical speed. Through his gun sight, Brenner could see the Spitfire's wings beginning to flex under G-forces that should have caused structural failure, and the British pilot's approach angle suggested either complete loss of situational awareness or a deliberate collision course that made no military sense. It was only in the final 3 seconds before impact that Brenner understood he was witnessing something that no German pilot had ever encountered and no Luftwaffe tactical manual had ever addressed. Squadron Leader Hartwell's Spitfire hit the center of Brenner's formation at 420 miles per hour, with his toggle switch depressed and 40 pounds of plastic explosive armed for detonation. The controlled explosion occurred exactly as his calculations had predicted, neutralizing his aircraft's wing structure and engine mount, while creating a debris field that expanded outward in a perfectly spherical pattern. The psychological effect on the German pilots exceeded even Hartwell's most optimistic projections. Oberleutnant Fischer, flying wing position to Brenner's immediate left, later described the experience in his combat report as watching the sky itself explode in front of our formation. The expanding cloud of metal fragments, burning fuel and engine parts forced every German pilot to take immediate evasive action, breaking their coordinated attack pattern and scattering them across a 10-square-mile area of airspace where they became vulnerable to individual engagement by the remaining Spitfire escorts. Hauptmann Brenner himself pulled into a vertical climb that exceeded his aircraft's structural limits, causing compression failure in his port wing that forced him to abandon the engagement and return to base on a single engine. But the tactical implications of Hartwell's sacrifice extended far beyond the immediate disruption of a single German attack. Flight Lieutenant Davies, leading the second section of Spitfires, had positioned his 4 aircraft to take advantage of the confusion created by Hartwell's attack, diving on the scattered German formation while their pilots were still recovering from the shock of witnessing an Allied fighter deliberately sacrifice itself in front of their guns. In the 6 minutes of combat that followed, Davies's section claimed 7 confirmed victories against German pilots who were psychologically unprepared for aggressive action from an enemy they had expected to withdraw after taking losses. The bomber formation completed its attack run without losing a single aircraft to fighter attack, dropping 123 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on the Focke-Wulf factory with an accuracy that exceeded all previous missions. But perhaps most importantly, the German fighter pilots who witnessed Hartwell's attack carried the psychological impact back to their bases, where stories of the sacrificial Spitfire began to erode the confidence that had made Luftwaffe interceptor units so effective against Allied bomber formations. The immediate aftermath of squadron leader Hartwell's sacrifice created a tactical situation that German commanders had never anticipated and were unprepared to counter. The second wave of Luftwaffe fighters, approaching the bomber stream from a different angle, found their radio frequencies filled with confused reports from Brenner's surviving pilots about explosive aircraft and flying bombs disguised as fighters. Oberst Wagner, commanding the fighter defenses from his operations bunker near Amsterdam, initially dismissed these reports as combat stress or communication equipment failure, but the mathematical evidence soon forced him to reconsider his assumptions. In the 12 minutes following Hartwell's attack, German fighter pilots claimed only 3 bomber victories despite having numerical superiority and optimal attack positioning, a success rate that represented less than 1/3 of their normal performance against unescorted bomber formations. More significantly, German pilots began reporting heightened caution when approaching Allied fighter escorts, with many pilots breaking off attacks prematurely when British fighters adopted aggressive intercept postures that might indicate additional sacrificial attacks. Flight Lieutenant Davies, now leading the reformed Spitfire escort, exploited this psychological advantage by ordering his pilots to adopt head-on intercept courses against every German formation that approached the bomber stream, creating the impression that multiple Allied fighters were prepared to sacrifice themselves to protect the bombers. This tactical analysis shows that the psychological warfare element proved so effective that the third wave of German interceptors arriving from bases in northern Germany failed to press their attacks home despite having a 4-to-1 numerical advantage. By the time the bomber formation reached the North Sea on their return flight, they had faced nearly 200 German fighter sorties, while losing only 2 bombers to mechanical failure and 1 to anti-aircraft fire. The mathematical impossibility of this result forced Luftwaffe tactical analysts to conclude that Allied fighter tactics had undergone a fundamental change that required immediate countermeasures. But no amount of tactical analysis could prepare German pilots for the psychological impact of facing an enemy willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to neutralize them. Word of squadron leader. Hartwell's sacrifice reached Royal Air Force headquarters through the combat reports filed by surviving members of his formation, but the official response was initially one of horror rather than recognition. Air Marshal Cunningham, commanding Fighter Command, convened an immediate board of inquiry to investigate how an RAF pilot had been allowed to modify his aircraft with unauthorized explosive devices and why no superior officer had prevented what appeared to be a clear violation of every safety protocol in military aviation. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, the engineering officer who had discovered Hartwell's modifications, faced court-martial charges for failing to report a dangerous breach of aircraft safety regulations, while the entire 611th Squadron underwent intensive investigation to determine whether other pilots had made similar modifications to their aircraft. But the mathematical results of the September 23rd mission could not be ignored by commanders who had watched bomber losses climb toward unsustainable levels over the previous 6 months. The 47 B-17 Flying Fortresses had completed their mission with a loss rate of only 4% compared to the 28% average of previous deep penetration raids. More significantly, intelligence reports from occupied Europe indicated that German fighter pilot morale had suffered a measurable decline following reports of Allied self-sacrifice tactics, and Luftwaffe intercept rates against subsequent bomber missions had dropped by 35%. Within 2 weeks of the Board of Inquiry, Air Marshal Cunningham had classified all details of Hartwell's modifications under the Official Secrets Act, while quietly authorizing a feasibility study into aggressive defensive tactics for long-range fighter escort missions. The study, conducted by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, concluded that controlled aircraft sacrifice could be an effective force multiplier in situations where conventional tactics had proven inadequate, but recommended against implementing such tactics due to unacceptable personnel losses and potential violation of international law. The recommendations remained classified for 37 years, during which time Squadron Leader James Hartwell was officially listed as eliminated in action during routine fighter escort operations, with no mention of the circumstances that had made his sacrifice tactically significant. The ripple effects of that single morning's action extended far beyond the immediate tactical success over the Focke-Wulf factory at Marienburg. German fighter tactics began to incorporate specific countermeasures against aggressive Allied intercept procedures, including extended approach distances that reduced intercept efficiency and mandatory abort procedures when Allied fighters adopted head-on attack courses. These tactical changes reduced overall German fighter effectiveness by an estimated 12% over the remaining months of 1943, saving an estimated 300 Allied bomber aircraft and approximately 3,000 aircrew lives. Flight Lieutenant Davies, who had led the Spitfire formation after Hartwell's sacrifice, was promoted to squadron leader and given command of the 611th Squadron, with specific instructions to study and document aggressive escort tactics that did not require aircraft destruction. His subsequent innovations in fighter coordination and psychological warfare became standard Royal Air Force doctrine for long-range bomber escort missions. But perhaps more significantly, the mathematical principles that Hartwell had discovered through his unauthorized research began to influence Allied tactical thinking at the highest levels. Air Marshal Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, incorporated force multiplication through tactical sacrifice into strategic planning for the final year of the air war over Europe. The mathematical models developed from Hartwell's example showed that single aircraft properly employed could achieve tactical effects far beyond their apparent capabilities when used to exploit enemy psychological vulnerabilities rather than purely physical ones. By the spring of 1944, Royal Air Force training programs included classified modules on asymmetric engagement tactics that taught fighter pilots to use aggression and apparent disregard for personal safety as force multipliers against numerically superior opponents. Historical analysis demonstrates that the mathematical foundation of modern air-to-air combat doctrine can be traced directly to calculations that Squadron Leader James Hartwell had performed alone in a maintenance hangar during the darkest months of the Bomber War. The personal cost of this tactical revolution remained hidden from public recognition for decades after the war's end. Squadron Leader. Hartwell's parents, living quietly in their Yorkshire village, received only the standard notification that their son had been eliminated in action over occupied Europe while performing his duty with courage and distinction. His father continued working the limestone quarry until his retirement in 1952, never knowing that his son's final minutes had been spent calculating the mathematical relationship between personal sacrifice and tactical advantage. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, the engineering officer who had discovered Hartwell's modifications, served out the war under a cloud of official suspicion, but continued his research into aircraft modification and emergency procedures. After demobilization, he established a small aircraft maintenance company in Leicestershire that specialized in emergency repairs and field modifications. In 1967, while consulting on a civil aviation accident investigation, Morrison encountered Captain Davies, the former Royal Air Force officer who had led the Spitfire formation after Hartwell's sacrifice. Their conversation, recorded in Morrison's personal journals, revealed for the first time the full extent of Hartwell's pre-mission planning and the mathematical calculations that had guided his final decision. He knew exactly what he was doing, Davies told Morrison. Every wire, every calculation, every tactical assumption had been tested and verified. James didn't take his own life that morning. He solved a mathematical problem that was eliminating our bombers faster than we could replace them. The journal entry, discovered among Morrison's papers after his death in 1981, provided historians with their first detailed account of the tactical innovation that had changed the course of the Allied bombing campaign. But for nearly 4 decades, Squadron Leader James Hartwell remained an anonymous entry in Royal Air Force casualty lists, his contribution to victory measured only by the lives he had saved rather than the recognition he had earned. The declassification of wartime documents in the 1980s finally allowed military historians to piece together the full scope of Squadron Leader Hartwell's influence on air combat doctrine. Professor Elizabeth Manning of Cambridge University, researching her doctoral dissertation on Royal Air Force tactical innovation, discovered references to the Hartwell modifications in previously classified Air Ministry files dating from late 1943. Her subsequent investigation, published as The Mathematics of Sacrifice in the Journal of Military History, revealed that Hartwell's tactical theories had been studied and refined by military analysts throughout the final 18 months of the war. The psychological impact assessments conducted by the Royal Aircraft Establishment showed that German fighter pilot effectiveness had declined significantly following encounters with aggressively defensive Allied fighters, and that this decline had contributed to the overall collapse of Luftwaffe resistance to daylight bombing operations. More significantly, Manning's research demonstrated that the tactical principles discovered by Hartwell had influenced post-war development of air-to-air combat doctrine in ways that remained relevant to modern fighter operations. The concept of using apparent tactical recklessness to achieve psychological advantage became a core element of pilot training programs throughout NATO forces, while the mathematical models for calculating force multiplication through individual action were incorporated into strategic planning software used by military commanders worldwide. In 1987, the Royal Air Force officially acknowledged Squadron Leader Hartwell's contribution to victory by establishing the Hartwell Medal for Innovation in Tactical Aircraft Employment. Awarded annually to pilots or aircrew who demonstrate exceptional creativity in solving tactical problems through unauthorized but effective modifications to standard procedures. The medal's inscription, taken from Morrison's engineering notes, reads, He solved problems that others had accepted as unsolvable. Captain Klaus Brenner, the German fighter pilot whose formation had been scattered by Hartwell's attack, survived the war and eventually immigrated to Canada, where he worked as a commercial pilot until his retirement in 1978. In a 1983 interview with Aviation History magazine, Brenner provided his perspective on the encounter that had ended his combat career and influenced his post-war decision to leave military aviation. "I had shot down 63 Allied aircraft before that morning, over Holland," Brenner recalled. "I understood the mathematics of aerial combat, the psychological factors that determined victory or defeat. But watching that Spitfire pilot choose to sacrifice himself in order to neutralize us changed my fundamental understanding of what war could demand from individual human beings. I could never again approach combat with the confidence that had made me effective, because I realized that some of my enemies were willing to pay prices that I could not match." Brenner's combat reports, preserved in German military archives, documented the tactical adjustments that Luftwaffe units made in response to Allied sacrificial fighters, and his post-war analysis helped historians understand how individual acts of self-sacrifice could influence strategic outcomes far beyond their immediate tactical effects. "One man's decision to break the rules eliminated more German pilots than any single conventional engagement," Brenner wrote in his unpublished memoirs. "Not because his sacrifice shot down our aircraft, but because it neutralized our confidence in our ability to predict Allied behavior. Fear of facing enemies who valued mission success more than personal survival made us cautious when we had been bold, defensive when we had been aggressive." Brenner died in 1991, having spent his final years speaking to military audiences about the psychological dimensions of air combat and the importance of understanding that mathematics alone could never capture the full complexity of human courage under extreme circumstances. The mathematical models that squadron leader Hartwell had developed during his sleepless nights in the maintenance hangar continued to influence military thinking long after the specific tactical situation that had inspired them became historically obsolete. Defense analysts studying asymmetric warfare during the Cold War discovered that Hartwell's calculations regarding the force multiplication effects of individual sacrifice provided insight into guerrilla tactics and unconventional resistance movements that conventional military doctrine had failed to address. The Central Intelligence Agency's classified study of individual action in strategic context, produced in 1968 for military commanders facing irregular warfare in Southeast Asia, cited Hartwell's example as proof that single individuals, properly motivated and positioned, could achieve strategic effects that exceeded their apparent capabilities by several orders of magnitude. The study's mathematical appendix, derived directly from Hartwell's original calculations, showed that psychological force multiplication could transform tactical defeats into strategic victories when applied by individuals willing to accept personal costs that conventional military logic deemed unacceptable. These principles were subsequently incorporated into Special Forces training programs throughout the 1970s and 80s, where elite military units learned to exploit the psychological advantages gained by demonstrating apparent disregard for personal safety in order to achieve tactical objectives against numerically superior opponents. From an educational perspective, modern counterterrorism doctrine continues to reflect Hartwell's insights into the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective tactical advantage. Though few contemporary military theorists realize that their strategic thinking traces back to calculations performed by a Royal Air Force pilot trying to solve the mathematical problem of escort fighter inadequacy during the darkest days of the Second World War. Today, nearly 8 decades after squadron leader James Hartwell made his final calculation above the Dutch coast, his influence on military aviation remains visible in ways that extend far beyond historical commemoration. the tactical manual used by modern Royal Air Force fighter pilots, includes a chapter on aggressive defensive tactics that draws heavily on principles first demonstrated over the Focke-Wulf factory at Marienburg. NATO fighter pilot training programs incorporate psychological warfare elements based on research that began with analysis of German pilot reactions to Hartwell's sacrifice. The mathematical models used by military strategists to calculate force multiplication effects in asymmetric combat situations include variables first identified in Air Ministry studies of the September 23, 1943 mission. But perhaps most significantly, the tradition of individual tactical innovation that Hartwell represented continues to define the culture of military aviation, where pilots are still encouraged to find creative solutions to tactical problems that conventional doctrine cannot address. Flight Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a Royal Air Force Typhoon pilot who received the Hartwell Medal for Innovation in 2021 after developing new intercept procedures for defending against drone swarms, described the continuing relevance of his example in her acceptance speech. Squadron Leader Hartwell proved that the most powerful weapon in any pilot's arsenal is not technology or firepower, but the willingness to think beyond the limitations that others accept as absolute. He showed us that the mathematics of warfare change when individual human beings decide that mission success matters more than personal survival. Her innovations, developed through unauthorized testing similar to Hartwell's hangar experiments, have since become standard Royal Air Force doctrine for defending against the asymmetric threats that characterize modern aerial warfare. The limestone quarry in Yorkshire, where James Hartwell's father worked until retirement, has been converted into a peaceful memorial park with walking trails that wind through the restored landscape his family had shaped for generations. A small plaque near the main entrance, installed by the Royal Air Force Association in 1993, identifies the location as the childhood home of Squadron Leader James Hartwell, but provides no details about his wartime service or tactical innovations. Visitors who walk the trails have no way of knowing that the mathematical principles governing modern air combat doctrine were first conceived by a young man who grew up among these hills, dreaming of flight while his family blasted stone from the earth. The transformation seems fitting for a man whose greatest achievement was finding ways to turn apparent limitations into unexpected advantages, whose legacy lies not in public recognition, but in the continued survival of aircrew who benefit from tactical innovations he pioneered. In the end, Squadron Leader Hartwell achieved exactly what his calculations had predicted. He solved a mathematical problem that had seemed unsolvable, saved lives that conventional tactics would have sacrificed, and demonstrated that individual courage, properly applied, could overcome numerical disadvantages that military logic had deemed insurmountable. Historical analysis shows that his sacrifice remained officially unrecognized for decades, which would not have surprised him. After all, he had performed his calculations based on tactical effectiveness, not historical recognition. He had broken the rules not for personal glory, but because mathematical analysis had proven that breaking the rules offered the only path to victory. The question that remains nearly 8 decades later is whether contemporary military personnel possess the mathematical insight and moral courage that enabled Squadron Leader Hartwell to see beyond conventional limitations and risk everything for a calculated chance at tactical success. Modern warfare presents challenges that require the same combination of technical innovation and personal sacrifice that characterized his final mission. But in an environment where individual initiative often conflicts with institutional risk management and political oversight that would have prevented his unauthorized modifications before they could prove their effectiveness. Would today's military systems recognize and support the kind of creative, tactical thinking that Hartwell represented? Or would contemporary safety protocols and command structures prevent the very innovations that might provide solutions to seemingly impossible tactical problems? The answer matters not only for military historians studying the evolution of air combat doctrine, but for current and future aircrew who may face their own versions of the mathematical challenges that Squadron Leader Hartwell confronted above the Dutch coast on September 23, 1943. His example suggests that the most important qualification for military leadership may not be the ability to follow established procedures, but the courage to calculate new solutions when established procedures prove inadequate to save the lives entrusted to your protection. Share this story of innovation born from necessity, of sacrifice that multiplied into salvation, and comment below with your thoughts. When conventional wisdom fails and lives hang in the balance, would you have the mathematical courage to break the rules that others consider sacred? Would you trust your calculations enough to risk everything on a theory that had never been tested in combat? Squadron Leader James Hartwell proved that the mathematics of courage can overcome the arithmetic of despair, but only when individual human beings decide that solving impossible problems matters more than following possible procedures. Remember his name, and remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from those willing to fail spectacularly in order to succeed mathematically.